In the 14th book of Israel here this evening, we're going to be in chapter 19. This is page 249, and it's titled, The Planned Genealogies of the Kingdom, number 2, the breeding program. Inside the seed is the blessing. And this sermon was done 20 years ago, in 6/22 of 1996. I'd like to start in verse 2 here. Pastor makes a powerful statement here. He says, Yahweh, He's actually controlled a breeding program to bring forth a holy seed that would bring a blessing then to everyone who's ever lived. To all nations, all families of the earth would be blessed through that holy seed that He's bringing forth. And then Pastor refers to Yochanan 1, chapter 1, verse 1, which says, In the beginning was the plan of Yahweh. And Pastor's comment here, he says, He already had it laid out, His plan, Yahweh's plan, to do this, to bring forth His family, the holy seed, and He guarded it very carefully. He, of course, He's sent His prophets down through the years to scold those who knew the plan but was actually involved in it but who had altered from it. I'm going to go over to verse 5 here. But he shows here that Yahweh had this planned out from the beginning. Every detail, I believe every detail Yahweh had planned out here. Not just to bring people on the earth or create people, fleshly beings, but that He had a plan, a full plan, that covered the whole planning of the family, His plans to bring forth the peace and joy and love to the complete universe and to wipe sin out eventually. Of course, He starts this in His family and in this breeding program of the genes. Yochanan 1 verse 1, In the beginning was the plan of Yahweh, and the plan was with Yahweh, and the plan was Yahweh's plan. The same plan was in the beginning with Yahweh. All things were done according to it. Just like in Revelation 12 verse 1, there appeared a wonder in heaven, and that's was speaking of Yahweh's plan, which He and we're the finishing of that plan for this in these last days. I mean, it'll continue certainly after the last days are completed, but this is it's a wonderful moment in the history of Yahweh's plan here that we're living in at this time. The whole household followed His laws, and it was in His plan. So all these things that occurred, they didn't just occur accidentally. They occurred by Yahweh's will to bring forth this holy seed. And I showed you some of this about what the commentators said, and I said the only thing we were interested in, the separation that we were interested in here was how Yahweh, rather than Yahweh's people, that is Abraham, how He separated them from the rest of the world. So He called Abraham out of the world, and he guarded him, and He taught him. We're going to see. He made a separation between Abraham and the people around him. How He separated Abraham from the rest of the world, from the people who were not following the laws of Yahweh, and how He found within Abraham what He wanted in the gene line. Let's go down to verse 12 here. And I'm skipping around, skipping somewhat, but following the verses, but not reading every one. Verse 12, But what He found in Abraham was a spirit of humility. You know, it's a characteristic Yahweh's looking for in us, spirit of humility, that came forth in His genes down from Adam, who He first taught the laws of Yahweh, Adam and Eve, and certain of those genes came on through to Abel, not to Cain, but to Abel. Cain probably had some of those genes, but Cain yielded, as we see that people can do. And then verse 13 here, You can go either way. It's not like Yahweh set you in a gear and you have to follow it. You can go either way. And that's the choice. That was the part of Yahweh's plan where we had to choose righteousness. We have to make a choice. And that's a critical part of Yahweh's plan. Abraham had to make a choice to follow Yahweh's righteous laws, and he chose to follow Yahweh. So you could go either way. You could follow the genes that suggest this is the right way, and your conscience, you could know, is saying to you, don't go this other way, don't do this, it's going to bring evil. It is evil. But you do have this in your conscious mind, or in your subconscious mind, that's coming forth from the genes that were planted there and came clear down from Mother Eve. Everyone is descended from Adam and Eve. In fact, to you today, and especially to Yeshua, and was guarded so closely at that time to get down to Yeshua, so closely that Yahweh could actually predict this man, Yeshua, will do a certain thing, and he's going to bring forth my will, Yahweh's will, and he's going to do these things. Verse 14 here. Well, he knew this because of this breeding program. And then he's done the same thing, guarding it so closely to where he says in the last days, 2 men would establish my house. So, Yahweh predicted that the witnesses would establish, he prophesied is a better word, that the 2 witnesses would establish his house in these last days, Jacob and Yisrayl Hawkins. All of these things he can predict because of this breeding program, and we'll see this. The more you pay attention and learn what I'm trying to show you here, the more you'll understand this great plan that he has here. And up to verse 15 here. And in verse 3, I will confirm an oath. I will confirm the oath I vowed to Abraham your father, that is your seed. And here this is Genesis 26. Pastor's reading from Genesis 26, and he's speaking to, it's verse 3 here, Genesis 26, verse 3, speaking to Isaac, Abraham's son. Verse 3, I will confirm the oath I vowed to Abraham your father. Verse 4, and I will make your descendants, that is your seed, multiply as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your descendants, and Pastor says that is your seed. And I brought this out last week, all of these lands. Yahweh promises the 144,000 priesthood an inheritance. And then you saw in the other one, Pastor says, if you remember where he said that you would inherit these things, he said, look up in the stars, because your seed is going to inherit all of these things that you see up there in the heavens. Your seed is going to inherit it. That's you. That's us. That's us. The seed of Abraham. And the pastor says here, you are the seed of Abraham if you do the will of Abraham, of course. It's conditional. And he said, in your seed, now get this, inside your seed, it is, in the middle of it, somewhere in this little bitty tiny seed that's coming from you, all of these things are put there. And then in verse 18 here in this sermon, now science knows and understands that this little tiny sperm, and I don't want to go into this too much, Pastor says, in detail, but in this little tiny sperm that gets with the egg, and half of the genetic material comes from the father, and half of the genetic material comes from the mother. They make the person. And in there are all these kind of things, the color of your skin, the color of your hair, the size of your lips, your nose. And then verse 19, but all of these things are put in this tiny little seed, and this is what Yahweh is saying here, but no one ever catches it, seems to think and thinks, well, I wonder what he could be talking about in the seed, in the seed. But if you notice here in the scripture, he's reading the scripture here now, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because of the choice, the righteous choice that the 144,000 priesthood has made. For what I have placed in this tiny sperm here. Verse 20. Verse 5 of Genesis 26. Because, and then he shows here how this is getting there. It's getting there through the teaching, I'll repeat that, through the teaching, and of course yielding to it, the choice, making the correct choice, choosing Yahweh, choosing Yahweh's way. But if you have children, you can say, son, don't do this or don't do that. But Pastor's making a point here. If they see us smoke, what are they going to do? They love their dad, right? They're going to want to be just like Dad, even though Dad tells them, son, don't smoke, it's bad for your health, it'll kill you. Okay? But the thing is, if we our children, they want to imitate mother and dad. So, so we have to be aware of that. What we practice is what we teach. Verse 21. But if you're treacherous, Pastor says, and you fight and you fuss and you live this kind of life, you are going to put this in your children. Now, not just because you're standing there teaching them to do it, but because while you're breeding, these genes of yours become being this treacherous person are going into those genes. And they're going to have in their genes something that's going to make them want to hit with the fist or slap with the palm or pull hair or stuff like this or fight and kill and so forth. So who we are is passed down to our children through our genes. And I'd like to go over to verse 23 here. But if you change now, Pastor says, if a person changes for the better, then he puts this same breeding then in that change. He starts planting the change, and that goes into the genes. And then it's deposited into the mind, which controls the body of the child. It actually deposits that gene there, that desire, that feeling, that motivation, if you will. So he says, in your seed, in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice. Because Abraham obeyed my voice, it's in this seed, Pastor is saying. Verse 25, verse 5 of Genesis 26, I believe. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes. It's in your seed. And in that seed, because he did this, all the nations of the world will be blessed. All families of the earth will be blessed because of Abraham. It's in that seed because Abraham bred it into that seed. Okay, because of the righteous life he lived after Yahweh called him out. Over to verse 27 here. And in Genesis 11, verse 26, he said, now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram. And then in verse 29 he said, then Abram, and before Yahweh changed his name to Abraham, his name was Abram. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and Yahweh later changed her name to Sarah. And I'm going to skip down to verse 29 here, reading part of this. Sarah, or Sarai, she was actually a niece born to one of Abraham's uncles, Pastor says, but that was brought out in Rashi's commentary. Okay, and then skipping down to verse 30 here, in Isaiah 51, verse 2, here it says, he says, look to Abraham your father and to Sarah, who bore you, not that they were children, exact children of theirs, but because they were carrying this gene in their bloodline. And the scripture continues here, For I called him alone and blessed him and increased him," speaking of Abraham. And then in verse 31 here, Pastor's reading from Romans 4, verse 19, and he said, "He did not weaken in the faith when he considered the fact that his body was as well as dead." Now this is talking about Abraham having a son. Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children until they were very old. So, but Abraham trusted Yahweh, that Yahweh would provide a descendant for him. So continuing in verse 31 at the top of the page there, the right-hand column, Pastor says, "As a man matures and gets older, he also mellows and he also gets wiser. And in this wisdom, he starts putting, or rather this starts going into his genes as well, because he's planting it inside his mind." So Yahweh kept Abraham to a certain age. He did this for a purpose, and also to Sarah herself, because between the two of them, being of old age and overcoming, so Yahweh gave Abraham and Sarah a couple years for overcoming. In fact, we're going to find out Yahweh gave Abraham 25 years from when he was called out until Isaac was born. So, being of old age and overcoming, they weren't this way as children. They were as feisty and rowdy as all of you as children. And we children, we should quickly convert. Okay, we shouldn't be this way. We should listening to the teachers and following the rules. That's Yahweh's way. Learning the hard way, that's not Yahweh's way. So, but Pastor's making a point here that Abraham was. He and his wife were old when they had their son. But as they get older and wiser and start kept yielding to the laws of Yahweh, this went into their bodies. And not only into their minds, but into their genes, which they then put into Isaac. So Isaac had a head start because Yahweh put it in the breeding. I'm going to go over to page 254 here, in verse 37. If you remember, we were able to actually change the nature of these animals. Actually, I'm going to skip this part here. Pastor speaks down here in verse 38. "I can show you when a child will place his hand on a crocodile there." And he was answering a question. Will children be born after the millennium? And he's saying, yes, of course. And he cites the scripture here. "I can show you when the child will place his hand over the crocodile then after the nature is changed, the crocodile's nature is changed, and he will play with the lion and the lamb together after the nature is changed. A child," and that word child, if you look it up there, it means infant. Down to verse 40. "But yes, there will be children. There will, in fact, this process will never stop, brethren. The children will always be a thing, but they won't always be taught sin. And the breeding will get so sincere in bringing forth the holy seed, because this will increase also. Because remember, only the holy seed, those who will change and become holy, will ever get into the kingdom to begin with, or ever receive eternal life. And from then on, the breeding process goes uphill. And soon, we're going to have children who will never sin. They'll be just like bird dogs, They'll always spot that bird and do exactly what they're supposed to do. And they will never vary one iota of Yahweh's laws, because there will also be teachers and guides, of course, for those children. Verse 41, Romans 4:19, Pastor says, or he reads the scripture here, he did not weaken, Abraham did not weaken when he considered the fact that his body was as well as dead. In other words, he was old. Since he was about 100 years old, and remember he was 75 years old when he was called up, and Sarah's womb was also dead. Yes, it was dead, but through the process that Yahweh put, through the power of Spirit Holy in keeping her alive and the womb alive and so forth, and the seed alive through their old age, they put all of this into the seed of Abraham, and through that seed came down to Yeshua, and of course to you today. To you today. Verse 20, no unbelief made him waver. Abraham's belief did not waver regarding the promise of Yahweh, but was strengthened by the faith and gave glory to Yahweh. In seeing this, seeing what Yahweh had foretold that he would be doing, and it wasn't just like he said to Abraham, well, Abraham, because of your seed, I'm going to take your seed and do this. No, the full plan was there, and Abraham understood this, and he understood that Yahweh was planting these genes into his seed, and those seed would come down to Yeshua. And continuing in verse 43 on top of the page there, they knew this plan, and they wanted to be part of the plan. All of them knew the plan of Yahweh, and they were strengthened as Abraham, and as you will get stronger if you'll understand this. And just bear with me and catch everything I say. It'll make your confidence much stronger in what Yahweh has planned, and the reason you're here right now, on this the Sabbath day, here in the great house of Yahweh, and spread throughout the world, through the technology, listening to Pastor's sermon here. Because it's no accident that you're in this building listening and understanding the plan of Yahweh. Verse 21, being fully convinced that Yahweh has power to do what he has promised, that is why his faith was accounted to him as righteousness. Verse 23, now this was not written for his sake alone, and Pastor comments here, all of these things that Yahweh shows here, showing his total plan of this breeding process and the plan of building a family, because this is his doing, this is the reason it's his family. He's creating a family by this breeding process. Turning over to page 256 here. This is Romans 4, verse 24. But also for us, to whom it will be accounted, if we believe on him who raised up Yeshua, our Messiah, from the dead, who was handed over for our offenses, all according to Yahweh's plan, to bring forth the unblemished lamb to make atonement for sin, and was raised up for our justification. Romans 9:9. For this is what the word of the promise said, at this time I will come. In other words, Yahweh himself had this planned, but Pastor's words here, but Yahweh kept this back because he wanted to put in Abraham's genes exactly what he put in him. So he painstakingly taught Abraham, and Abraham yielded. The same thing Yisrayl Hawkins is doing for us. Painstakingly teaching us and praying that we're yielding to the teaching that he brings forth. So he painstakingly taught Abraham, and Abraham yielded. He was submissive. He was a submissive man, very humble man. So he yielded to this teaching and the spirit of Yahweh and the law of Yahweh. Then the scripture continues, at this time I will come to Sarah. I will come and Sarah will have a son. At that time Yahweh himself had planned. Remember, in the beginning was this plan, and all things were brought about by this plan, and the part of that plan was keeping Sarah and Abraham to an old age before they ever had Isaac, and putting those genes into Isaac. See Hebrews 11, verse 11, speaking of Sarah, through the faith, Sarah herself also received strength and conceived seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged or trusted Yahweh, who is faithful, who had promised. She judged Yahweh faithful, who had given them this plan from the beginning. In Genesis 12, verse 1, now Yahweh had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your kindred, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And this is part of the separation that Pastor talked about. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make you your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you and curse him who curses you. And Pastor writes here, if you bless Abraham in your heart, if you say, yes, I'm going to follow this righteous way as Abraham did, then, of course, you're putting this into your genes. Right then and there, it's being placed there. It's going into your mind. It's building in your subconscious mind, and at the same time in your genes. Going up to verse 59 here. Actually, verse 60. Genesis 12, verse 4. So Abram departed of Yahweh and spoke unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed. So he trained him 25 years, Pastor says, 25 more years after that, before Isaac was born. 25 more years before he was allowed to conceive a son by Sarah. Verse 63, then Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So it's the seed, Pastor says. It's not just the descendants, because it's not even based on that. It's not based on bloodline. It's based on overcoming. That's what it's based on, overcoming, and what's in the genes. That's what he's speaking of here. It's what's in the seed. To your seed I will give this land. And he built an altar there to Yahweh, who appeared to him. Down to verse 70, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of Yahweh Most High. He was Abraham's teacher, a priest of Yahweh, great priest of Yahweh, Melchizedek. He's the one who taught Abraham, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abraham by Yahweh Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And he blessed, and blessed be Yahweh Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Pastor says, showing the power over the gods. Just to finish up here, this first part, I'm going to go over to verse 74. He took him outside and said, this is speaking of the covenant in Genesis 15, verse 6, which Yahweh made with Abraham. Look up in the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And he said to him, so shall these become the possession of your seed. And Pastor defines the word seed here. Seed here, it means yours to have. It's all ours to have. If we're faithful to Yahweh, faithful to his plan, faithful to his house, servants to one another, it's all ours to have. Seed here, it means yours to have, yours to have. Look up in the heavens. See all of this up in the heavens, because this is what you're going to inherit. Genesis 17, verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am Almighty Yahweh, walk in my ways and be perfect. Well, here he was teaching Abraham, of course, through Melchizedek. Verse 2, I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abraham fell on his face and worshipped Yahweh. Pastor says, well, this falling on his face showed the humility. Worship means to serve, and he committed himself to serve Yahweh. Verse 7, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants, your seed. May Yahweh bless your understanding. If you'd all please stand for our second teacher this evening, the great Kohan Michael Hawkins.
Please be seated. Man, is that awesome or what? In your seed, when you think about all the stuff that the Khan just covered, the promises that was given to Abraham, And as Pastor was talking about, it's all in the seed. These things are passed on from generation to generation, the righteousness. And the thing is, when you look at the world, and the world's seed is nothing but horrible diseases and horrible birth defects. You know, the world is dying. But yet in the seed of the house of Yahweh is righteousness. And you can see that. You can definitely see that in the children that are born because of the righteousness that they have and the righteousness that they show forth. You know, I mean, they really learn these things. Let's start off here on verse 81. Pastor says, boy, it just about blows my mind when I see, you know, what Yahweh can do, how brilliant this being is, and we're actually being called into his family. And one day we're going to be like him. And we will have this great intelligence ourselves, and we have very little of it now, what he actually has planned for us to have. You know, and the great intelligence that Yahweh has, you know, I mean, he is the creator of the universe. He's thought of all of these things out, you know, beforehand. I mean, when you think about how he had to, you know, everything that he built. Now, before he even built the earth, he had to build all the things that would actually allow the earth to sustain itself and to stay in place and so forth. And then he put everything on earth, and once all of that was made, then he made mankind, you know. So everything that was created, that's why mankind was made last. And then the very first thing he'd done is he gives them the Sabbath day, you know, and teaches them these things. So you can see the incredible intelligence that Yahweh has, that he had to make all these things. But verse 82, he says, but if you think about the grain of wheat or the sperm from a man and what Yahweh placed in it, and he's done so because of a plan, then you can think of the magnificent knowledge that he has to have done this. You know, you think about it, I mean, you know, when there's an egg and then there's, you know, millions of sperms, they're so tiny, they're just surrounding the entire egg, just fighting to try and get in there. And even though there may be millions of them, just one enters. And as soon as that one enters, you know, there's electrical charge that goes on, and that's life. That's conception. A human born has just been conceived. And within that tiny little seed has all the genetic makeup to make an entire person. You know, and from there it grows, cell after cell after cell, multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. And every cell knows what it's supposed to become, because all of that information is in that tiny seed, that tiny genetic code. That's the magnificence of Yahweh. Well, all of this stuff was according to his plan, and he passed this on, and within that seed is the determination to overcome sin and become righteous, and that is what he has worked with generation after generation and passed these things on, and this is why we have the promise of Abraham today. That's the reason why you're here tonight, you know, learning of these things, is because Yahweh put it in Abraham, and eventually throughout the generations, thousands of years, that information entered into you, and that's why you're here tonight. So remember that. This is all part of Yahweh's plan. Okay, let's see. You can understand parts of it already, but you see in the scriptures that you see all of this is Yahweh's plan to have you sitting in his house at this time, so you would be a blessing to all of the people who's lived before you and could actually bring forth this character into other people and the great character into them. You remember the scriptures talk about, jump over to verse 85. The scriptures, next page. The scriptures talk about the fact that there would be other people, you know, children to be born. And Yahshua himself said, you know, that there would be other people in the flock. You know, he says that are not here at this time, telling his disciples. But then Psalms talks about a generation yet to be born and so forth, talking about us in these last days. Verse 85, he says, so it's up to you then to prove to Yahweh that you will accept his laws as Abraham did, because the choice is ours, right? It's given to us as a choice, what we want to do. Look at verse 86. Genesis 17, verse 8. I will also give to you and your descendants after you. Notice, I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to give to your descendants after you, and I will be their father. In other words, you're becoming the family of Yahweh. That's the promises that we have, is to be like Yahweh himself. And that's an invitation. Remember, the word calling, you've been called. The word calling means an invitation. You've been invited to be a part in Yahweh's house. And like it says, you know, In Kepha, it's reserved in the heavens for us. All we have to do is just qualify for it. But we have to show Yahweh that desire, that we desire to be in that family. Look at verse 91 there. For the begettings, notice, for the begettings to come, every male among, now this was talking about Abraham in Genesis 17 here. Starting in verse 10, you see where he says that this is a sign of the covenant that your descendants after you have to be circumcised and undergo circumcision. Now, in verse 91, he says, for the begettings to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your own household. Now, he says, if you remember, the first sermon I brought on genes years ago, he says, I showed you the two things that could alter this. The mind, that is, what you feed into the mind can alter it. And also disease or an accident. Okay? So these are the two things. What you feed into your mind or disease or an accident is what can alter this genetic makeup that Yahweh has placed in the seed and has passed this on from Abraham. Now, if you, like Yeshua said, if you do the works of Abraham, then you've proven that you are of his seed. If you don't do the works of Abraham, then you've proven that you're not part of his seed. And, you can be descendants, and that's why Pastor put in there so, the emphasis on is not descendant, but it's seed, okay? Because when it talks about Yeshua, Messiah, it says, remember in Galatians, it talks about seed, the seed of Abraham, okay? So it's not so much the descendants, because you can be, descendants of Abraham, but it doesn't make you his seed. The seeds are the ones who perform righteousness, the works that Abraham himself did. Verse 97. So in this way, Yahweh kept this safe and kept it through circumcision. Now, what he's talking about here is that everybody that was to be born in his household and bought with money from a stranger or whatever, they had to be circumcised. And he says this is an everlasting covenant. And, of course, the benefits of circumcision is it prevents certain diseases and so forth. And so he says here, so in this way, Yahweh kept this safe, and he kept it out through circumcision. He kept these diseases. He says this is the reason circumcision was given to Abraham. It wasn't just because he wanted to get rid of the foreskin. It was because he wanted cleanliness to be put from one generation to another that would not defile the gene process that he wanted in Yeshua and in you today. Because there's, cervical cancer and so forth, other different types of cancers can be caused by those who are uncircumcised. So this was the means by which Yahweh used to protect the holy and righteous seed being passed on. Look at verse 99 there. Then Yahweh said to Abraham, for as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarah. Okay, and that means mother of nations. Okay, she is the mother of nations. And it's word 82, and it means mistress in the first meaning. It means a female noble, notice, and it means lady, okay? A female noble. It shows that she has, and this is why the women in the house of Yahweh, the queens of Yahweh's house, are called, the daughters of Abraham, okay? The daughters of Sarah, because of the fact that it shows a specific rank and office that we're talking about here. Then he goes on talking about how his grandmother, no one saw grandmother's ankles except grandpa, and about his mother, and how the word lady, growing up, that meant something, okay? When you were considered a lady, you were considered a very righteous and acceptable woman. Something totally different than what you see today. Women are not taught to be ladies. They're not taught to be that type of a woman. In verse 101, Sarah also means princess, and it also means queen. Okay, so these are some of the things that Sarah carried about within her name, within herself. Okay, because remember, names mean something to Yahweh. And when Yahweh renames a person, it shows that the fact that their parents didn't name them correctly. So when the time came when Yahweh had a certain work for that person, he renamed them and said, no, this is what you shall call yourself from this time on. In verse 102, it also means a head person of any rank or class that has rule or is going to be given rulership. Okay, now remember, Yahweh said, I will make man in my image, and he will be given rulership. So this also goes for the females, okay, as well. And this is what every wife should be striving to become, because Sarah means ruler or steward of any class that had ruler or rulership. Okay, and this is the magnificent thing about why the house of Yahweh honors and respects the women so much. You know, verse 103. Now that's the reason Yahweh named Sarah, because of what she will inherit in the kingdom, being a ruler, a queen of Abraham, who will have much rulership and will be head over many things. Now, not her husband, though, of course, but she'll never be a head over her husband. But if her husband, makes it to the kingdom, then, they will be together and can rule together and so forth. That's the great blessing that Yahweh says, because what Yahweh has joined together, no man can pull apart, right? It's forever. It's a vow that you make forever. And, your wife is the queen of your household, and you should treat her as such. Now, verse 106. Then Yahweh said, see, I see Ishmael. Because remember, Ishmael, okay, came forth from the bondwoman, okay? And remember, there was contention and so forth there that they didn't want to listen, and they made mockery of Yahweh's ways and so forth, and eventually they were let go. And they left the house of Abraham. They could have stayed and remained, but they chose not to. But Sarah, your wife, will be bearing a son, and you will call his name Isaac. So he was named before he was ever born, right? And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. And with his descendants, or with his seed, okay, with his seed. Now remember, you're only his seed if you do the works of Abraham. And it makes no difference whose descendants you are. If you're his seed, or of this seed, of this gene line, then after him, what I put in his seed, if you will have it, you will yield to it, in other words. Okay? So that's why it says, one day in our lives, all of a sudden, the switch was turned on, right? In our minds, and we understood, and we began to have this understanding when we came to Yahweh's house. Well, Pastor covers that too, in about that switch being turned on, Let's see, jump down to verse 115 there. For I have chosen him because, now this is talking about Abraham here, and Yahweh says, I have chosen him because he kept my laws, statutes, and judgments, remember. That's the reason why he chose Abraham, so that he might command, that is teach, so that he might teach his children and his household after him. Okay, remember, Abraham kept his laws, statutes, and judgments. That's one of the laws, right? Deuteronomy 6:7 is to teach your children. Well, Abraham had a very large household, remember, over 300 people, with all of his servants and so forth. But it shows that Abraham made sure that they were taught these things. So his whole household was taught in righteousness and followed these things. So you may teach his children in his household after him that they keep the way of Yahweh and do what is right or righteous. Remember, 1 Yahweh 3, if you perform righteousness, you do what is righteousness, you are righteous yourself, just as Yahweh is, right? Because Yahweh's making us in his image. If you go back, it takes you all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 there, when Yahweh says, I will make man in his own image. So if we do what Yahweh says to do, if Yahweh is complete righteousness and we follow what he says to do, then we're going to become made into his image and his likeness. And that's what Abraham did. So just that Yahweh may bring about for Abraham what he promised to him. That is, remember, he wanted to perform this promise to bring forth this bloodline, okay? This bloodline of children that would be born in future generations, that would pass on this gene of righteousness. And sometimes it would pop up in one generation and not in another, And it may, even in cases where there would be unrighteous parents, a child could pop up that would be righteous, and choose the right way. And then he could have children, and maybe his descendants would pop up and be righteous, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd fall right back into the footsteps of the generations before them, and then the next generation might, So it was all according to Yahweh's plan, according to what took place throughout the history of mankind as to when he needed to bring forth that gene and when he allowed it to not be there. But he always had to work, though. He always had that righteousness there in one way or the other. But you see, the Christian world can't understand that, and that's why they don't understand why certain things took place in the Scriptures, like even King David, what he went through and so forth, and yet how he could be called a man after Yahweh's own heart, But if you understand Yahweh's plan, you can see and understand those things. Verse 118, and then Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. Okay, and remember King Abimelech, remember he took her, and then he was going to take her as a wife because he thought, okay, this is Abraham's sister. It's not, she's free to be taken. And as a result, certain things took place there. But Pastor says, Yahweh had to do this. You've got to understand why this took place right here, because this was no accident either. It was planned by Yahweh, and Yahweh himself brought this about because he had to bring Abraham into a certain place, and that's where Abraham built and established his house, and that's where he built Abraham's family, or he started his family, right in the middle of God worshipers, okay? Remember, Yahweh will have a work wherever he chooses, right? So Yahweh brought this about so he could declare to the God worshipers, hands off, and not have them interfere with the breeding program, okay? So he did this on purpose because he wanted to show them that, look, I've got a plan in action here. Don't mess with it, okay? Because it's got to go through according to what he wants. Now jump down to verse 123 here. Because Abraham told Abimelech, the king, in a dream, remember he says, let this go, this is Abraham's wife, and he says, well, I didn't know it, and that's what he says here in the dream. He says, yes, I know, Yahweh says, yes, I know you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I did not withhold you, for I did withhold you from sinning against me. So Yahweh knew that Abimelech was unaware that this was another man's wife, and that, Yahweh kept him from taking her as a wife. Now let's see if he gets into that here. So this was his plan, and nothing occurred to these people except through what his already established plan. He had this plan from the beginning to keep this bloodline very straight and strong in Yahweh's way. You see this promotion, this protection here that he's been given? He takes him to the king himself, making Sarah very beautiful and very desirable in the eyes of men, takes him to the king, takes her to the king himself, and establishes before all of them, you touch this woman and you're dead. Okay? So he's showing them and putting it in their face that don't mess with this plan. Okay? And we'll get into this a little bit later, but in verse 125 it says, well, that's the reason that Yahweh had to establish this at this time. So he takes Sarah before the king and says, you tell this people hands off of this woman in order to keep this bloodline straight. So you see the lengths that he had to go through for you sitting here today, because these same genes came to you. Same thing came to you. Yahweh had, his plan is just so incredibly awesome. And he has gone through so much trouble, to get this into where it's at now. And this is a fantastic thing when you can, why he says, blessed are those who believe without seeing, because of the fact that everything that is written, the entire book of Yahweh was written for us in these last days to understand. No one else understood these things. The prophets themselves, as they wrote these things, didn't even understand what they were writing. They just knew that they were compelled so much and inspired that they had to get this put down in writing because Yahweh inspired them to do it. But they didn't understand what it was. They didn't understand Yahweh's plan. Not even the disciples themselves understood the plan of Yahweh. Yeshua understood, but they didn't, And so he, throughout the years, remember it was hidden for, 1,500 years or so, and then it was given back to us. And then the House of Yahweh has been working on it ever since, putting the truth together in there, because we're the only ones on the face of this earth that understand Yahweh. No one else does. This is why the assemblies can use, they'll use Yahweh's name, but then they'll turn right around and call him Elohim, because they don't have the understanding of who Yahweh is. We're the only ones that do. And it's something that we should really be astounded by for the great blessing that there is in knowing Yahweh. Look at verse 138 here. So Abraham prayed to Yahweh, and I remember this is afterwards, all this came to pass, and Yahweh revealed this to Abimelech, and now he calls forth for Abraham and says, hey, why did you do this to me, And then Abraham explains it, and in verse 138 he says, so Abraham prayed to Yahweh, and Yahweh healed Abimelech, his wife, and his maidservants. Then they bore children. In other words, they could not bear, because as long as they had Sarah in danger, Abimelech could not cause her pregnancy and disrupt this bloodline, this chain of genes that Yahweh wanted in Abraham and all of his brethren is for your protection. So Abimelech's whole house, his wife, his maidservants, everyone, his household was all affected by this. And Yahweh stopped this. He closed their wounds and so forth, as the scriptures talk about, to protect the seed of Abraham, okay? So that he wouldn't go through and commit adultery and so forth and mess up that bloodline and the plan that Yahweh had. And this was Yahweh's power. This was Yahweh's awesome power showing. It was just like when Moshe went in Egypt before Pharaoh and showed the power of Yahweh and his plan. Abraham did the same thing before these people here, showing them that this was Yahweh's plan. Verse 139, for Yahweh had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. All for the reason that these genes could come down so you could be taught by Abraham. You're still being taught by Abraham because of this righteous seeds, this righteous teaching that he accepted and humbled himself to, and it's in your subconscious mind whether you know it or not, and that's the reason why you're sitting here tonight. It's because of that. Praise Yahweh. Look at verse 147. Now Genesis 21:12. But Yahweh said to Abraham, do not let it be distressing in your sight because of the boy, because of your bondwoman. Remember, this was the problem when they had the conflict there. And, Sarah said, she's got to leave. She's got to go, And Yahweh explains to Abraham, don't worry about it. Don't let it be distressing. This is needful. It needs to be done. Go ahead and do it. For the fact is, remember his law says, if you choose to dwell together, then remain together. Even though there's an unbeliever in the household, if that unbeliever chooses to do what the law says, even though they don't believe in it, then you remain together. But if they don't, then separate. So whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac is your offspring, okay? Your Isaac, remember, he was the promised one. That's your seed. It's been put in your seed. So Isaac, your seed shall be called, okay? And this word called is number 7121, and it means to look up. If you look up the word, it means to call out, to address. That is to the ones being called by Yahweh down throughout the centuries. Your seeds are the ones that are going to be called into my family, into the house of Yahweh. It also means, that word called also means to address by name, those who are bidden, those who are called forth, to name and so forth. So you can see that Yahweh is going to name us, right? He has named us. Remember, this was part of prophecy when we took on the name of Hawkins and so forth and took on the Hebrew names. We put away the God's names and we took on names that were righteous in Yahweh's eyes. It also means preach, to make, proclaim, and publish. Okay, so these are the words which means call. In Isaac, your seed, it shall be called. Okay, look at verse 150 here. Now, Genesis 22, verse 18, he says, through, and that should be in your seed, not through your seed, but in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Because it's in his seed. It's not just through the works of Abraham, but it was actually in Abraham, okay? And remember this. Maybe you can remember this, what Pastor taught years ago. You remember when he talked about being the one sent? And when he talked about the scripture believing in the one sent. It's not believe in the one sent. It's to believe into the one sent. Right? You remember that? It's to believe into the one sent. Okay? Because you have to be, that has to be a part of you to where you realize who the one sent is and what that means to you and how you are a part of him, because you are his spiritual offspring. You are his seed. You are the seed of the two witnesses. Okay? So keep that in mind. So it's the same thing here with Abraham. He says, in your seed, not through your seed, but in your seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And you should start seeing this now, because this is why Satan hates us so much and fights against the house of Yahweh so hard, because she actually knew the prophecies of the potential of mankind, and she wants to destroy us, you know. So in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you obeyed my voice. Okay? You obeyed my voice. That's Yahweh's voice. The ones who taught Abraham. He believed what was taught. Now in Webster's, in verse 152, in Webster's he says, the word gene, he says, now understand this, he said, the scientists have studied the word gene. It means the unit of heredity transmitted in the chromosome. And if you look at the bottom of the page, that partially through interaction with other genes controls the development, and this is a gene, okay? It's transmitted into the chromosome. The chromosome is that little X-looking thing, okay, where all the DNA and stuff is at. That partially through interaction with other genes controls the development of heredity and character. Character, okay? The genes, they know this, they don't know how it works or whatever, they don't understand what the house of Yahweh understands, but they admit it, that it changes a person's character, okay? And it's within the genes, it's in the genetic makeup of a person. Character, it controls the character of the person, because Abraham kept my laws, statutes, and judgments, then this would be passed on through his seed to others, okay? And brought down to us in these last days. And it also means in heredity of character and also thought, you know, and you think about the Pope and the Vatican, you remember, their genes are evil because they think to change the laws of Yahweh, but our thoughts are to be like Yahweh himself. In Brown, Driver, and Briggs, also the word seed means to be marked by moral quality, okay? Marked by moral quality, and we know what morals are, as rules and so forth, of being like Yahweh, the quality, the essence of being like Yahweh himself by keeping his word. Jump down to verse 154. The seed is marked by moral quality, persons or community as such a quantity, a transition to this through such cases, okay? Transition, and that word transition talks about movement, changing from one position or state or one subject and so forth to another. In other words, being passed on. And the seed comes from one person, and the moral character comes from one person to another, and it's actually moved through these seeds from one person to another person, and that's actually what's shown in the Hebrew word. Verse 157 there, quickly it says, from this word gene, we see in the Hebrew language this movement, this passage or change from one position or state, the change of character from one stage or subject. Okay, of course, subject being the person. You know, passing this genes through to another person. And that's all in breeding. It's being bred in this gene, putting the gene from a father or a mother into another person. Okay, jump over verse 159 here. Well, if you're treacherous, he says, then you're not putting this into your you're putting this into your genes, and that's not what Yahweh wants in his family, right? But notice what Yeshua, he says, Yeshua, if you remember, he didn't even want to break a wounded limb or bend something that was already bent. Remember the prophets talk about this. He wanted to do nothing of harm to anyone. And that's a magnificent example that Yeshua set for us, you know. And then if you look over in verse 163, he says, a lot of this is going into my book now on this very thing, in search of a Savior that we will present next to the Hebrew people, and turning the Hebrew people back to the genes, of course, that Yahweh originally planted in Abraham, and he wants them to carry with them. And that's what he's working with us, okay? And in case y'all don't have a book, I just want to show you this. Take a look at that. Look at that little guy. He is so small. He's wearing his kippah. Look at his fingers. He's so tiny, what, a few months old? And there he is with this big, huge book of Yahweh. You imagine how massive that thing looks to him? And he's looking at it so intently. He may be even understanding it too, right? Because of the power that the children of Yahweh's house is being born with right now. Remember that. They're being born with stuff that you don't have, you know. It takes us a lifetime of studying stuff and seeking Yahweh, but the next generations keeps getting holier and holier, okay? And that picture just astounds me when I look at it because of the fact that those little tiny little fingers, you know how a baby is. I mean, little video, tiny little fingers, you know, that wrap that whole hand around one of your little fingers, you know. And he's just looking so intently at that book of Yahweh, and it's like he's just studying it, you know. Astounding. Think about that, because that's what Yahweh is doing with us. He's putting that righteousness in the seed, and that's what he began with Abraham. And that's what he's bringing to completion with us in these last days, as we are the children and the seed of Abraham. May Yahweh bless you, man.